On February 14th of 2008, a young man dressed in all black, carrying a shotgun inside of a guitar case, walked into the Northern Illinois University with an evil plan. What he would do when he got inside was absolutely frightening. This is the case of Steve Kazmierczak. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also water bottle flipping. Oh man. Oh man. Yes! Let's go! But anyways, today's case is a not too covered one about a terrible incident that occurred on Valentine's Day of 2008 at the Northern Illinois University. There's a lot of oddities about this case, and the why is still hazy. Stephen Philip Kazmierczak was born on August 26th of 1980 at 11:57 p.m. in Illinois to Robert and Gail Kazmierczak. He had a sister named Susan, but they did not get along well at all. At the age of 5, Stephen had some sort of eye surgery. As a child, he would constantly watch horror movies with his mother. It was said that Gail was very protective of Stephen and wouldn't let him play with other kids very much. But while Stephen, or as he went by Steve, attended elementary school, he was not motivated. He was inconsistent, he was disruptive, and constantly displayed bad behavior. In the 3rd grade, his teacher said that Steve appears very impulsive and does not want to go back and check his work. Therefore, there are a lot of errors. At our conference, we can discuss ways to help Steve work up to his potential. Steve was also considered to be an underachiever, and some teachers actually reported that they think he might have some sort of learning disability or ADD problem. This was because Steve could hardly focus or concentrate. He had a bad attitude and was very impulsive. One of his teachers during elementary school found his writings to contain violence and deemed them as inappropriate. Now, Steve wasn't exactly a bully, though he did pick on others and get picked on himself. In middle school, Steve became pretty bad, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to mention that his parents tried to get an evaluation of him from the school officials during this time, and for some reason, the request was denied. So we'll go to Steve's 8th grade year, and he had a dog. I don't know what the name was, but I do know that it was a pug. Steve, in front of his friends, would drop the dog, light it on fire, and much more evil things. You'll understand that shortly. This year, or 1994, was the first year that Steve would have a run-in with the police. So to get a better understanding, Steve was in the 8th grade and a part of a friend group that consisted of himself, a guy named Joe, another guy named Joe, a guy named Rich, a guy named Adam, and a few other people. Steve was already looked at a bit funny as his friends weren't 100% his friends, but in middle school, he played the saxophone in the school band. Hanging out with friends was one of Steve's favorite things to do. And speaking of favorite things to do, one of my pastimes is playing video games. Today's sponsor is Cash Frenzy, which is a Vegas-style mobile slots game that is free to play and a super exhilarating experience. Check it out by downloading it via the link in the description, the pinned comment, or simply by scanning the QR code. There is literally 300 different types of slots to play, anywhere, at any time. It's almost as if you're actually at the casino, but with the luxury of being wherever you want. For the last couple of days, I've been playing Cash Frenzy pretty much non-stop. Here's me actually hitting a jackpot. Yes! Awesome, right? One thing that I've noticed is that I tend to hit the jackpot a lot. The odds of winning are extremely high, which is great. A cool option that they have is the mini games, and my personal favorite is called Seaside Camping, where you're able to collect energy by spinning in the slots, and then you're able to merge items together to serve orders and get amazing prizes. I just find that one to be very fun, and it makes me feel like I'm working towards something. Currently, a limited Independence Day event called the Freedom Cruise is running, and you can join in and claim up to $200 worth of rewards. Now go ahead and download Cash Frenzy by using my QR code that's on the screen or the link in my description to have as great of a time as I have. Thank you so much to Cash Frenzy for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video. While at school one day, Steve and the first Joe, along with several other kids, were taught how to make Drano bombs by a guy named Pete. A Drano bomb is compiled of the toilet cleaner Drano. Steve and Joe decided to try and make one for themselves, and Steve looked at this as a way to really make a good friend. So on Saturday, February 5th of that year, Joe and Steve waited until dinner and met up on the corner. They then walked to a supermarket and bought the supplies needed. Eventually, they went up to a neighbor's house and put the Drano bomb on the porch, and it blew up. The next day, on February 6th, Steve and one of his friends, Joe, were detained for reckless conduct. At the time, Steve was 13 years old and Joe was 14. No one ended up getting injured, and not much damage, if any, was caused. A few days later, on February 10th, the guy Pete, who taught Joe and Steve and all of the other guys how to make Drano bombs, was caught red-handed by his mother, Marianne, with all of the materials. Marianne called the police, gave up Pete, and Pete gave up Steve and Joe. Eventually, the police talked to both of the boys and scared them into not doing anything like that ever again. Steve was apparently apologetic about this and gave the police about 15 students' names who knew how to make these bombs. Steve told the police he'll never do anything like this again, and we'll see about that. So Steve and all of his friends in the year 1994 would all just walk up to each other's windows and knock because, well, phones weren't exactly prevalent yet. One day, Steve's friend, the other Joe, had went to tap on Steve's window to see if he wanted to hang out. Joe looked into Steve's window and saw him apparently doing the you-know-what with his pug. Yuck. But Joe went to school the next day and told everybody. Apparently, Steve then told his friends Adam and Rich that he was teaching the dog dominance and showing it who was the alpha dog? What? Yikes. But after that, Steve started to really lose friends, obviously. He was afraid that his friend Adam was going to steal the rest of his friends, and so Steve started talking bad about Adam behind his back to the other Joe and a guy named Lee. Joe and Lee would tell Adam that Steve was talking trash, but Adam was just building a case on him. Adam at the time was starting a little business with a friend named Mike where they would raise feeder pets for snakes, and Steve wanted to be a part of it. So one day, Adam invited Steve over, but little did Steve know that this was all going to be a big setup. Adam set up a microphone to record what Steve had to say, and Steve ended up admitting that he stole the other Joe's brothers and sisters' CDs and alcohol, and that he trash-talked a lot of people. Later into the week, specifically on Friday, Steve went to the other Joe's home, and Joe, Lee, and Adam were all playing video games. When Steve sat down on the couch, Adam turned off the video game and then began to play the recording of Steve talking bad about everyone. Steve tried to stop it, and he even hit Adam, but at that point it was too late. No one wanted to be Steve's friend anymore after that. Steve went home so angry and upset, and developed a plan to bring a knife to school the next day to try and fight Adam. When the next day rolled around, Steve tried to fight Adam after school, and then he pulled the knife out. Adam told him it's not worth it and that everyone's going to see what he did and he'll get in trouble. Steve ended up looking around and agreeing, but that's when the teachers came in, broke it up, and Steve ended up getting suspended. Adam was given detention. Several months later, Steve was now in the 9th grade. The other Joe's older brother was on the high school football team and told everyone that Steve was bad news. And so by the time Steve even stepped foot into the high school, he was already disliked. Steve, being an oddity, decided that he might be able to fit in with the goths. He started to wear trench coats, chains, black leather boots, the whole 9 yards. He didn't really fit in there, but pretty much the entire 9th grade, Steve didn't have many friends. But by late 9th grade into 10th grade, he tried to rekindle his friendships with the other Joe, Lee, and Adam. But with Adam, there was always this extra tension. It was also, I think, this year that Steve had a knee surgery, but I don't really know why. By the 11th grade, things would really start to change for Steve. This year, his parents put him on lithium because I guess at some point he was diagnosed as being bipolar. That year, he became friends with the other Joe, Lee, and Adam again, and he started hanging out a lot with Pete, the guy who taught them how to make the bombs. On September 22nd of 1996, Steve and Pete got arrested after trespassing on railroad tracks. Their plan was to go through some dumpsters by a Pepsi corporation. For the next few months, Steve was about to go through a hard time and become depressed. Now, why exactly Steve was so upset isn't known, but we do know that he started to become colder and more antisocial. He decided that his life was no longer worth living and that he was going to take himself out. Steve came up with a plan and decided to sell all of his belongings and create a will to give his friends the other stuff. On December 14th of 1996, Steve took a ton of Tylenol and called a girlfriend or friend of his. Steve's parents immediately threw him into a mental hospital, which lasted for about a week. He was put on a ton of medication and went from being about 6'4", 160-ish pounds, to about 300 pounds in a few months. His friends said that he was zombie-like, and it was like his personality was just sucked out of him. A few weeks later, a few popular kids had walked up to Steve and decided to bully him. One of them said, "Hey, Steve, what's up?" Another one said something else, and the other one grabbed Steve's tray of food and flipped it onto the ground. Steve ran out into the parking lot, and one of his friends followed him. Eventually, he told this friend that he wants to hurt some people. The rest of Steve's junior year was awful, and things certainly weren't looking up. On April 8th of 1997, Steve's parents requested a case study evaluation at his high school, but for some reason, again, it was denied. The school instead gave Steve's parents a handbook on how to deal with students with disabilities. 5 days later, on April 13th, Steve took about 40 Ambien in his wrists. Immediately, he was hospitalized again for about a week. Several months would pass, and I don't know what happened in between that time, but by late 1997, Steve was now a senior at Elk Grove High School. On November 4th, Steve told his mother that he doesn't want to go to school anymore, and they got into an argument. At about 11 p.m. that night, Steve took an entire bottle of Depakotes and went to sleep. Nothing really happened to him besides when he woke up, he just felt very tired and drowsy. Eventually, Steve got dressed, went to school, but his teacher immediately noticed that he was super drowsy. So he went to the nurse's office and told her that he wants to die and that life sucks. The school decided to send him to another mental hospital, and he stayed there for about 3 days. Only 2 months later, though, on January 10th of 1998, Steve found himself back in the mental hospital because of thoughts. About a month would go by, and on February 7th, Steve went back to the mental hospital. 2 days later, on February 9th, Steve's father went to the police and told them that Steve's friend Pete is dealing drugs and keeps them hidden in his radio, and also that he wants Steve to stay away from these guys. On February 11th, Steve left the mental hospital, but literally the next day, on February 12th, he returned for thoughts and mood swings. Steve, by this point, is on a ton of medication and is severely up and down. His father is actively trying to figure out more information on Pete so he can get Pete arrested, and he does on March 2nd. On March 10th, Steve got into a fight with his mother about Pete after dinner, and he stormed out of the house at about 7 p.m. wearing his trench coat. His mother called the police and filed a missing persons report and told them that Steve was mentally disabled and needed his medicine. Steve tried to go to a few friends' houses, but was unsuccessful, and he returned home about 2 days later on March 12th. His dad called the police and told them that Steve returned and that he will handle it. At some point, Steve had gotten a job with his friends at their local library. Steve's job was to restack books. Well, on March 17th, Pete walked into the library and confronted Steve and told him that he could have him taken care of for less than an ounce and that he could have his house burned down. Steve, this same day, filed a complaint with the police and told them that Pete threatened him and his family. Pete was arrested later that day and given a court date for the next day. About 2 months would pass, and on June 7th of 1998, Steve graduated from high school, the 133rd student out of 185. This day, or the day before, Steve actually slit his wrists with the plans of taking himself out, so once again he started giving all of his stuff away, but didn't follow through with it. His parents decided that they're going to send him to a group home, but he has to turn 18 first, and that would happen in August. So Steve decided to work for the summer, about 20 hours a week, at a restaurant. The entire summer, he was getting into fights with his mom and sister about cleaning his room. On August 2nd of 1998, he was hospitalized again for another attempt and got out on the 5th. Steve was set to go to a group home, or the Mary Hill home by Thresholds, and in his member description, it gave us a great look to what kind of medicine he was on for several years as a child into early adulthood. I think Threshold was the company that ran the group home, but at the current time, Steve was taking 20 milligrams of Prozac in the morning, 10 milligrams of Zyprexa whenever he went to bed, and 500 milligrams of Depakote in the morning, and 100 milligrams when he went to bed. Steve's former medication included Paxil, lithium, Cylert, Risperdal, and Cogentin, and his time at the Mary Hill home, to sum it up, was awful. They made him wake up early, monitored his medication, made him clean a lot, and he was paid to work in the kitchen. Doesn't sound that bad, but Steve progressively got worse, and he told a psychiatrist that he could read people's minds and that he has special powers, and that he's been able to do this his whole life, but now the powers are only becoming stronger. Steve absolutely hated it at the Mary Hill home. He escaped from there multiple times, and each time he'd go to his parents' house and they'd take him right back. Around this time, Steve really got into Marilyn Manson, and on April 20th of 1999, something awful happened. Two young men, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, shot up their high school of Columbine. Steve looked at these two degenerates as heroes and people to look up to. By late 1999, on October 27th, Steve got a job working at a store called Things Remembered, and he was fired 3 days before Christmas because he kept getting into arguments. A few months later, on February 1st of 2000, Thresholds decided that Steve had enough things going for him that he could transition out of the group home into a single room. Now, the neighborhood that the Mary Hill home was at was horrible, but this one was even worse. Steve said that he would hear gunshots and people constantly pounded on his door. In March of 2000, Thresholds helped Steve get a job at Walgreens, but within only a month, on April 17th, he was fired for having bad attendance. 2 months later in June, Steve was hired at a place called Osco, which is a pharmacy. Steve once again was overweight at this point and began to feel bad about himself, and so he decided to stop taking his medication, and he began to have hallucinations of his ex-girlfriend. At about 12 p.m. on June 13th, Steve took 20 Effexors, or antidepressants. About an hour and a half later, his caseworker woke him up and then drove him to work. Steve, by about 6 p.m., was at Osco's, and he started feeling terrible, so he went to the hospital. Osco's ended up firing him sometime in July. By August, Steve had went on a family vacation to Wisconsin, and his family said that he was very angry and impatient unless he was on his medication. At the end of August, Steve and his mother went to his psychiatrist and talked about his medication. He told the psychiatrist how he's not psychotic anymore, which was a lie. The medication that Steve was on at this point was Prozac, Depakote, Seroquel, and Clozaril. In September of 2000, Steve began working at Kmart, and here he became very paranoid. He thought people were out to get him and that they were following him. Steve got into a bunch of arguments with coworkers there. He also got a job working at UPS during the nighttime, but he quit that almost instantly. A few weeks would go by, and all of a sudden, Steve started to wet the bed, and that happened several times. The doctors thought that it was most likely one of his medicines, and so they reduced it, and it kind of helped. In October, he went to visit his sister at the University of Illinois and decided that by next fall, he's going to enroll there himself. It's interesting though, because from what I read, Steve and his sister didn't get along well, so for him to go visit her was kind of bizarre. But Steve decided while waiting to go to the University of Illinois that he'd enroll at Truman College to at least try to get a few courses done. At this point, Steve started to possibly enjoy life and things seemed a bit brighter. Though another bad thing to happen is that on November 6th of 2000, Steve was at a meeting at Kmart when another employee apparently insulted him. So Steve decided to bump the guy while they were both in the smoking area because the guy tried to block the door. This guy punched Steve in the face, and Steve ended up beating him up, breaking his hand and getting fired. At Thanksgiving that year, Steve had a horrible one. Apparently his sister said she hated him, his mother wanted to send him away, and he also quit his therapist because of some dumb reason. Steve, a few days later, wanted to go back to his therapist and decided to officially follow through with something. He told his therapist that he wants to succeed and leave the past behind. The therapist told Steve that he has to be careful about getting involved into school and not worrying about his mental health because of how badly he'll crash. Boy, was that statement prophetic. By the end of January of 2001, Steve weaned completely off of his medication, though up until June of that year, he didn't tell anybody because he, for some reason, collected money off of it. Now in June, Steve decided to quit seeing his therapist, shaved his head, tattooed the letters FTW on him, or F the world. On June 21st, Steve moved out of the group home that had a bedroom for him into his own apartment. The next day, on June 22nd, Steve met up with his case manager from Thresholds and told him that he has been lying about taking his medication for months. A week later, on June 29th, they met up again, and Steve said he's doing okay without the medication, and his case manager told him that over the last 5 months, he's held one job for 3.5 weeks, quit school without earning any credits, quit therapy, lost friends, and tattooed himself. The case manager suggested that they try and expedite Steve's discharge because he didn't want to work with them and they don't want to work with him. He was becoming too self-destructive. Now, Steve did start seeing other specialists through the Chicago Department of Public Health, but on September 5th of 2001, Steve had a plan that he thought would fix everything. This day, he applied to the Army and checked no on his application when it asked if he ever attempted. And he also put down no for frequent trouble sleeping, anxiety attacks, depression, using illegal drugs, or evaluated or treated for a mental condition. Obviously, Steve was lying about literally all of those things, but the Army accepted him anyway, and they gave him a $4,000 cash bonus. By September 20th, Steve was officially enlisted and shipped off to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to go to basic training. This short time would prove to be some of the happiest days of his life. Steve absolutely loved the Army and having a sense of order. On December 1st of 2001, he completed basic training.
Private Stephen Kazmierczak, Chicago, Illinois.
Afterwards, he was told he'd be stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, in the 6th Air Defense Artillery Brigade. But right before that was about to happen, something else occurred. Somehow, the medical examiner found out that Steve had been hospitalized multiple times in the past because of his episodes and attempts. The Army put a flag on him. On February 1st of 2002, Steve was pulled into a room for a psychological evaluation. He tried to get the doctor to tell him what was going on, but the doctor wouldn't budge. 3 days would pass, and on February 4th of 2002, Steve was taken to the Army's medical center, and they threw him into the Army's mental hospital to make sure he didn't attempt to do anything stupid. Steve asked them what was going on, but they didn't say anything. Then the next day, on February 5th, the Army told Steve they found out he lied on his application about pretty much everything, and they informed him that they are going to kick him out. Steve was super upset about this. By February 13th, the Army got Steve back to his hometown. Steve decided to try and not let this get him too down, and so he applied to the Northern Illinois University, and they accepted him, and so he enrolled in the fall. By August of 2002, Steve was officially at the college, and he had a roommate named Aaron Mack. Aaron at one point told everyone that Steve was strange, and thus began the nickname Strange Steve. Now, throughout college, Steve had a pretty good time. He met a lot of good professors and some friends. Notably, in the fall of 2004, he met a guy named Mark and got a girlfriend named Kim. This was Steve's first girlfriend for quite some time, and so he was very anxious all the time, and it actually made him physically sick. So this was also Steve's senior year, and he wanted to get it over with. He had plans to apply for grad school at the University of Illinois, but Kim wanted him to stay around. So he ended up applying for grad school at NIU instead and got accepted. About 2 years would pass, and by January of 2006, Steve rented an apartment out of the dorms, and him and Kim were still together. Though their relationship was fading and they were constantly getting into screaming matches. On February 27th of 2006, the couple officially broke up, and this same day, Steve was recommended for the Dean's Award. Also, the police were called on Steve by his ex-girlfriend Kim because she was worried he was going to damage her property because he was bipolar. Not long after Steve and Kim broke up, a new girl would come into Steve's life. They both were in an undergraduate criminology course, and her name was Jessica Beatty. This couple hit it off extremely well, and they loved each other. By May of 2006, they both graduated and made plans to attend Northern Illinois University for graduate school in the fall. Another amazing thing happens for Steve when this year, he somehow won the Dean's Award. Steve, when he graduated, was given a Bachelor of Arts degree, He had a 3.88 GPA. He co-authored an article with one of his professors that went into the Journal of Criminology and Public Policy, and he also served as the vice president for Northern Illinois University's chapter of the American Correctional Association. He also did a few other things as well. Not only that, but Steve applied for a paid internship and actually won it, and that was his first choice of places he'd like to go. It really seemed like everything was falling perfectly into place for him. But this job, which was with the village of Buffalo Grove, just ended up not working right for him, and within 2 weeks, on June 2nd of 2006, Steve randomly left. He just couldn't take the stress or anxiety anymore. For the next several months, Steve honestly had a decent time. It's weird though, because someone mentioned during this fall semester at the college that Steve must be a mass murderer because he's such a nice guy. A bit eerie, but Steve was getting happier and happier. But that was all about to come crashing down. On September 25th of 2006, Steve's mother, Gail, died at the age of 57 or 58 after a lengthy battle with Lou Gehrig. Now, Steve hadn't been exactly close to his mother for quite some time, and he thought she hated him, so he said that he hated her. But unfortunately, Steve would also get the news that he wasn't going to be able to go to NIU for grad school because the university didn't have enough staff to teach the advanced criminology course. So to remedy this, a professor at NIU named Jim became really close with Steve over the past few years, and he wrote a recommendation for both him and Jessica to go to the University of Illinois. That was also the school that Steve wanted to go to anyway. Jim also recommended that maybe Steve look into getting a job as a correctional officer. He could help him do that. Steve's relationship with Jessica was very rocky, constantly up and down and arguing about stupid things. Still, in September of 2006, that month marked 5 years since Steve had been out of mental health programs, which meant that it wouldn't show up for a background check. And Steve needed a background check to be able to apply for a gun license. In December, he applied, and on January 17th of 2007, he was officially granted his license. On February 14th of 2007, or Valentine's Day, Steve told Jim he passed his correctional officer testing and will start working at the prison pretty soon. Steve also stopped going to his classes at NIU since he was transferring to the University of Illinois, and the work wouldn't transfer over. 5 days later, on February 19th, Steve bought a Glock 45 caliber handgun, and the next month he bought another shotgun and handgun. Steve decided instead of going to school, he'll just go to the shooting range because it doesn't really matter. Now, about 2 months later, something awful happened. Sung-Hee Cho had murdered 32 people at Virginia Tech, and Steve was fascinated by this. He sent basically all of Sung's writings to his girlfriend Jessica and a friend named Mark, and learned all about him. He learned all about his mental health history, his photos, the way he planned it, the videos, etc. Steve was obsessed with Sung, and the way that he talked about him was as if he looked up to him. Steve wanted to know all about what happened and exactly when it happened. He found the entire thing to be exciting. Another weird thing is that Steve wrote a paper for NIU called No Crazies with Guns, and he used the Virginia Tech massacre to analyze whether or not mentally ill people should be able to obtain guns, which is very ironic. Some time would pass, and by June of 2007, Steve and Jessica rented an apartment together, but they had separate bedrooms. Their relationship was so rocky at this point, and Steve by now is anxious about everything, and he misses Jim, his old friends, and he's really just having a bad time. Jessica told him that he needs to see someone, and so on August 3rd of 2007, Steve checked himself into a mental health center. He was worried about this though, because he doesn't want anything to go on his record, So he left out his entire past and basically just said that he has a little bit of anxiety and insomnia and stuff, and that he just wants some medication. The next day, Steve realized he messed up because him going there would go on his gun license and he wouldn't be able to buy more guns. Steve then drove to the gun shop and traded in his Glock 45 handgun because it was too big, his 22 caliber pistol, and a 20 gauge shotgun. This day he bought a Sig Sauer 380 for about $600. Not long after this, Steve told Jessica that one day he might just disappear and nobody will find him, that if anything ever happens to him, not to tell anyone about him. On August 6th, Steve felt like he really needed to go to a mental health facility, and so he rechecked himself in. He saw a psychiatrist and told them how he follows the number 3 and how going to this new school was a terrible idea and that he has horrible anxiety. The psychiatrist put Steve on 10 milligrams of Prozac every morning, and for the past 6 years, he was on no medication. Genuinely, things for Steve kept getting worse and worse. His anxiety was heightened all of the time. He had bad diarrhea, he was bloated, his stomach was also messed up. Not only that, but Steve and Jessica didn't get along well, and Steve and his sister Susan had been in communication, and things with them was also pretty bad. One day, Steve had an okay conversation with her and told her that he might be gay. Susan was also gay. But then Steve sent Susan a very harsh email on September 3rd of 2007. Susan, just because Jessica and I aren't dating doesn't mean I don't care about her as a friend. Decisions that I make often impact her since we are roommates, and she has expressed interest in going to Florida in November, although I am going alone to visit my father. Sometimes it is very frustrating talking to you because you sometimes seem blinded by your personal outlook on life, relationships, and even family. If you are going to judge me and threaten to hang up on me when we talk on the phone, then don't bother calling. I don't need the additional stress/abuse in my life. The only people who I've ever known were like this was my mother and yourself. She used to hang up on me as well at times when I called from Chicago, and I don't need you to pull the same bullshit. You seem to get angry at the most petty things. If you want to know the real reason that I don't often want to hang out with you, it is because I often feel that you judge me and others. An example, my interest in working at a prison rather than finishing school, my relationship at times, etc. And then you get incredibly mad at me for a decision that I own and one that doesn't affect your life in the least. It shouldn't be that way with family, especially your own brother. I'm not trying to quarrel with you, but this is something that I had to say. The next day, on September 4th, Steve went to the mental health facility again. The psychiatrist marked down that Steve's mother's death was a very traumatic experience for him, that he's still affected by it. They also marked down that Steve is worried about his father, who has medical issues and recently suffered a stroke. The psychiatrist upped Steve's Prozac intake from 10 milligrams a day to 50 milligrams a day, and also added Xanax into the mix at 0.5 milligrams a couple of times a day, and some Ambien as well. By September 25th, it was the anniversary of Steve's mother's death, and he thought about her a lot. Steve, by that point, already took himself off of the Prozac because it gave him bad acne all over his face and neck and back. He also started to get a bunch of tattoos by a guy named Jason. He got a tattoo of a dagger in his skull's head with a fiery background. Honestly, looks pretty cool. Steve's whole demeanor was changing, and things are about to get even worse. While driving to work at the prison one day, Steve was on the phone with Jessica when he drove past the turn he was supposed to make. Unfortunately, this made him late, and the job doesn't allow you to be late. If you were late, you were punished by having to start the training all over again. Steve then tried to turn around and speed to work, going about 85 miles per hour, and that's when he was pulled over by the police. Afterwards, he drove to a friend named Nick's house. Nick was a training officer at the prison, and he let Steve stay the night a few times to make his drive shorter. Steve then left an apology letter to Nick saying he's not continuing the training and also what had happened that morning. Steve then called the prison and told them that he's in some kind of trouble. So the superintendent of the prison had people go out and look for him, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. The police went to Steve's apartment, and they told him that he's wasting everyone's time. Now, as I mentioned before, Steve and his girlfriend Jessica's relationship was very rocky, and they were on and off. At one point, Steve started to try and find people on Craigslist to do dirty things with him. He met a male professor, and they did some nasty things. Same with some girls, specifically one named Kelly. Steve and Kelly hit it off kind of well, but their relationship was secretive because of Jessica, but Jessica had her suspicions. Steve was super excited in late October of 2007 because the movie Saw 4 was coming out. He really wanted to see it with Kelly, and he even bought a Jigsaw box set and sent Kelly a message. Kelly sent a message back saying something about doing the dirty with Steve if he had a scary mask on. So Steve went and bought the Billy the Puppet mask to do just that, and for Halloween he took these pictures, and they are certainly creepy. A few days before that though, on October 26th of 2007, Steve went to see Saw 4 with his sister Susan and Jessica. Somehow Steve gave away Susan's ticket outside of the theater, so him and Jessica went inside without her. This was after Steve and Susan really got into it, after Steve and Jessica really got into it. Later during that night, Steve sent Susan a very long email about how he truly feels about her. I'll sum it up. Basically, Steve said that being around Susan is horrible. Her attitude sucks, and he's done with her. Also, by November, Steve sent Kelly an email saying he likes her, but that he's done with her too. And Steve loved the Saw movies so much, he actually got a tattoo of Billy. Steve, for the next few months, continued his behavior on Craigslist with talking and trying to meet people, mostly unsuccessful. Steve spent Christmas of 2007, or his last one, with his dad, and told his dad that it's okay to stay in Lakeland, Florida. That's where his father lived. And Steve's sister Susan wanted their father to sell his home and move closer to where they live. Steve told him that he just wants him to be happy. 2 days after Christmas, on December 27th, Steve went to the gun shop and bought a High Point 380 and a 12-gauge shotgun. After this, for the next several weeks, he'll stay isolated and things will become darker. He wouldn't talk to any of his friends for weeks, and when he did, there was just a bunch of excuses. On January 7th of 2008, Steve paid $395 to get a tattoo of a pentagram. Its true meaning for him was unknown. Steve did get back into contact with his friend Kelly in January and his friend Mark, and told them basically a bunch of conspiracy theories to kind of sum it up. Steve also started to read a lot of books, but those books had interesting topics, such as the Antichrist. About a week before Sunday, February 3rd, Steve stopped taking his Prozac. This seems to be the day that he decided to commit a mass shooting and developed a very evil plan. The day before, on February 2nd, Steve had seen on the news that a guy had brutally murdered 5 women in a Lane Bryant clothing store in Chicago. That case is still unsolved, but this happening made Steve confident and set him into action. On February 3rd, though, he purchased more magazines for his High Point 380 handgun. On February 5th, Steve and Jessica went to a Marilyn Manson concert and had an absolute blast. The next day, on February 6th, Steve went to a gun shop and bought a Glock 19 for $554 and a Sportsman Model 48 shotgun, though it's most likely that he actually bought a Remington 870 12-gauge. I believe the police report was wrong. But by now, Steve has set this plan up in his brain, and he made a reservation for a Best Western hotel for a few days the next week. He went to the Bank of America and requested a cash advance for $5,000, and afterwards he went and bought a hard shell guitar case to conceal the shotgun. Steve also, for the next few days, went on Craigslist like crazy to find people to, He talked on the phone to multiple people, including his father, though not much substance was said. On February 11th, Steve woke up and at about 10 a.m., he told Jessica not to go to work and just to stay and hang with him that day. Once again, the relationship was really weird, but Jessica told him that she has to go to work. Steve told her that one day she'll be able to write a book about him. Jessica asked why she would be able to do that, and Steve said that he'll be her case study. After she left, he sawed the barrel off of his shotgun and got his arsenal ready to go. Later in the day, at about 3:30 p.m., Steve left the apartment and drove about 3 hours away to the Best Western Hotel, and he got there at 6:44 p.m. He ended up having to go to the Travelodge though, I think because of his credit card. I'm not too sure exactly why though. The Travelodge was just a worse hotel. Steve then later in the night erased his entire email account and later called Jessica and Kelly and talked to them about different things. The next day on February 12th, Steve bought 4 books for Jessica from Amazon and put the message, "You are the best, Jessica. You've done so much for me and I truly do love you. You will make an excellent psychologist or social worker someday. Don't forget about me. Love, Steve." Not only this, but Steve also bought Jessica a phone and memory card for $426, a purse for $300, and earrings for $40, and a bunch of other things. This same day, Steve wanted to buy Jessica an engagement ring, and so at 3:38 p.m., she called him back after he tried calling her earlier, and they talked about what size ring she wears and what finger is for marriage. This same day, or February 12th, Steve talked to his dad and afterwards bought Jessica an engagement ring for $1,435 from Amazon. He talked to her multiple times for several minutes at a time throughout that night. The next day, on February 13th, Steve went to the post office and sent Jessica a package. She'd receive it in a few days, but it contained a few books, including the one I mentioned earlier and one about serial killers. Now, when Steve would go to bed this night, the next day, he'd wake up an absolute monster. On February 14th of 2008, Steve woke up at the hotel surrounded by Red Bull and cigarettes. He got dressed in black shoes, black pants, a black t-shirt with the word in white letters that was above a red AK-47 on it, and he wore a black stocking cap along with a coat. Steve got all of his guns in order, specifically the Glock 9mm, the Sig Sauer 380, the High Point 380, and the 12-gauge shotgun. After taking one last huge chug of Red Bull, Steve left the hotel in a white Honda Civic, and he listened to a CD he made titled Final CD with Marilyn Manson's song Last Day on Earth as the final track. Steve listened to that song after he parked at Northern Illinois University. After the song was done playing, Steve got out of his car, grabbed the guitar case, put on his backpack, and went to one of the halls, specifically Cole Hall. He walks basically up to the door that led to the stage, dropped the backpack and guitar case, grabbed his shotgun, and got ready. The door that Steve walked to was where the professor would be, so Steve would be looking up at the students. The time was about 3 to 3:02 p.m. All of a sudden, the door busted open as Steve kicked the door in, and he went onto the stage. For just a brief moment, he stood there and looked at everyone, and that's when he raised his shotgun and began shooting. Now, for some reason, Steve brought birdshot rounds with him, which are known to not be as lethal. Regardless, he kept shooting and had to reload. This is when people began yelling, "He's reloading," to give people time and awareness to try and escape. After Steve fired all 6 rounds from the shotgun, he then threw it on the ground and pulled out his 9mm Glock. Next, he walked up and down the aisles, firing his Glock pistol, shooting a total of 48 times. He never had to use the other 2 pistols he brought with him. After killing 5 people and injuring 18 other people, Steve went up onto the stage one last time and took himself out. The police had been closing in by this point, after several 911 calls were made. The nightmare was now over, but the aftermath was certainly awful. Why exactly did Steve do what he did? And what exactly set him off? Also, why did he choose to go to his old college? What made Steve want to stop taking his medication? Was it the fact that his girlfriend Jessica said that she didn't like the medications and that it made her nervous that he was taking them, and so she persuaded him to stop? And a great question would be whether or not he began hallucinating again. Questions that we want to know, but unfortunately we'll never know the answer to. The only thing we can do is speculate. And with speculation, after learning all about Steve, it's clear he was manic, full of anxiety and paranoid. I don't think medicine helped him too much, and if anything, he was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. From the time that he was a child, supposedly doing nasty things with his dog, until he grew up and acted the way that he did, I guess he was just a lost cause. What Steve did was absolutely sickening, and he murdered 5 innocent people that he never met or ever knew. I don't know why Steve bought his girlfriend Jessica an engagement ring. If he knew he was going to do that, a lot of it just doesn't make sense to me. But Jessica said that Steve was the kindest and most gentle person that she knew, and what he did was nothing like him. It was nothing like him, but it was 100% him. So it was exactly like him. Gail Dubowski was a 20-year-old sophomore who was just beginning her career path in anthropology. That was her major, and her professor said Gail was intelligent and made smart observations. Gail was also studying Russian, and she was always there for anyone that needed her. Catalina Garcia was a 20-year-old sophomore from Cicero, and she was majoring in elementary education. Catalina was active with the Latino Resource Center, and that was a big part of her life. She was creative and artistic, and looked at as someone who was loved a lot and loved others. Catalina was very optimistic and a caring young woman. Juliana Gant was a 32-year-old junior who was majoring in elementary education. Before going to NIU, she was in the United States Army and Reserves for 12 years as a sergeant first class. Juliana served a tour of Bosnia, and while working in the military, developed a love for teaching. She was considered to be a very good teacher. She was super smart and kind and highly intelligent, and a very motivated woman. Ryan Mace was a 19-year-old sophomore and an honors student who was going for a psychology major. Ryan was a good, funny, and brilliant young person. She studied French, played the violin, and she loved reading. Ryan loved the series Harry Potter, and she was looked at as being very motivated, smart, and a friendly girl who was always laughing. Daniel Parmenter was a 20-year-old sophomore who was about 6'4" to 6'5", and he was an avid sports player. He loved football and rugby. Daniel was considered to be a very nice guy, someone you could count on. Daniel never lost his temper, and he was always smiling, and he was intelligent, honest, and had a very strong work ethic. His family and the rest of the victims' families talked so highly of them, and it's an absolute shame that these 5 young adults never got the chance to fully take on their lives because of one selfish individual. I hope that their families have been doing okay, and that these 5 innocent souls are resting peacefully. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.